Greetings, dear friend, and a most sincere welcome. I am genuinely delighted you could join us for Bedtime Biographies, the place where we collectively unwind and gently drift away to the calming accounts of truly extraordinary lives. Our biographical exploration this evening starts deep within the 19th century. The atmosphere is heavy, thick with the dense coal smoke that billows from countless chimneys. Factories have sprung up and stand like tired, enormous giants across the landscape. And here, in the heart of the British Library, sits a man with a famously wild, unruly beard, his hands scribbling furious, fast-paced notes right into the margins of heavy, well-read books. His name is Karl Marx. His core mission: to deeply analyze and explain exactly why the global social structure felt so fundamentally broken, and to suggest why, with a little intellectual rigor and revolutionary effort, it absolutely did not have to remain in that fractured state. Before we properly commence with a detailed account of Marx's life story, just a brief, sincere thought. If these calm, deliberate explorations of history's most significant lives provide you with the relaxation you need to unwind at the end of the day, please do consider taking a mere moment to gently tap the like button on this video and, of course, subscribe to the channel. Your support genuinely helps other curious, thoughtful minds successfully discover these important historical narratives. We are also always deeply curious to hear your own reflections and considered opinions. Do let us know in the comment section below what you personally think of Marx and which historical figure you'd like us to delineate and explore in our very next bedtime biography. Now, the term Marxism gets circulated and tossed around quite a lot today, sometimes simply as a political slogan designed to rally supporters, and often, conversely, as a fear-inducing scare word intended to frighten opponents. But if you carefully strip away all of that extraneous noise and the constant political posturing, you find that at its absolute core, Marxism is truly just a simple, profound question. What if the act of work didn't have to cause pain or alienation? What if the products we diligently create, the garments we sew, the sustenance we cultivate, the very dwellings we construct, actually belonged, collectively, to the people who exerted the labor to produce them? Marx dedicated the entirety of his professional life to diligently chasing this powerful, all-consuming idea, an intellectual pursuit that led him through multiple bankruptcies, years of relentless exile, and, it must be noted, the consumption of a multitude of very bad, poorly prepared cups of coffee. Of course, following his death, history grabbed hold of his complex, revolutionary theories and subsequently ran wild with them. There were vast, earth-shaking revolutions, powerful manifestos issued to the public, and entire governments rising and dramatically falling while invoking his name. But for us tonight, we are not here to focus on the spectacular fireworks of political upheaval. We are simply here, in this peaceful space, to meet the man who existed behind the myth. He was a brilliant, often stubborn, deeply human thinker who simply held a fervent, unwavering belief in the possibility of a fairer, more equitable world for all. And now, as the daylight wanes and the evening winds down, let us begin the gentle task of tracing the life and consequential times of this immensely influential political and economic thinker. This, then, is the bedtime biography of Karl Marx. The complete and detailed story begins precisely in the year 1818 in the tranquil, picturesque riverside town of Trier, Germany. It was a special place where the ancient, stately Roman ruins were allowed to gently crumble and decay right beside the meandering Moselle River, and where the extensive vineyards stretched out, looking sleepy and verdant under the bright, pervasive summer sunlight. It was here, in an unassuming, respectable house on Brückengasse Street, that a young boy named Karl Marx drew his very first breaths. His father, Heinrich, was a well-regarded, highly respected lawyer who held Enlightenment ideals deep in his philosophical worldview. He was a thoughtful man who had previously converted from the faith of Judaism to Lutheranism. Primarily, it suggested, for the sake of improved career prospects rather than any profound spiritual awakening. Young Karl would ultimately inherit that pragmatic, realistic streak from his father, along with something far more volatile and combustible in his character. The Marx household pulsed and hummed with a constant, lively intellectual energy. Heinrich made sure the home was filled with dense volumes written by philosophical titans like Voltaire and Kant, while Karl's mother, Henrietta, skillfully kept the pantry well-stocked with creamy Dutch cheese and, perhaps more importantly, kept the children supplied with a steady stream of old, insightful Dutch proverbs. Young Karl absorbed all of it. The intellectual books, the lively political debates, and a profound, underlying sense that the entire world might one day be successfully reshaped purely through the power of human reason. By the time he achieved entrance to the Friedrich Wilhelm Gymnasium School, his educators were already making a note of two distinct characteristics. Firstly, the boy was writing sophisticated, profound essays of startling depth for his age. And secondly, he possessed what a key instructor described as a most unsettling habit of systematically interrogating every single premise that was placed before him for study or reflection. At the tender age of 17, Marx personally penned his required graduation essay on the union of the faithful with Christ. The chosen language was conventional, adhering to the expected school standards, but between the conventional lines of text, something genuinely radical pulsed. A powerful vision of humanity united not by strict religious dogma, but instead by a shared, common struggle. It was as if the young, emerging man already intuitively sensed the overarching theme that would ultimately consume his entire adult life. That our immediate, earthly bonds and social connections matter far more than any abstract, distant heavenly ones. His headmaster, perhaps perceiving the deep trouble that lay ahead for such a restive mind, carefully wrote in Karl's official leaving certificate that while the student clearly demonstrated brilliance, his intellectual work was frequently suffering from an overabundance of intellectual energy. This description perfectly captured the boy's restless mind. Meanwhile, the picturesque Rhine Valley surrounding his hometown continued to whisper of older stories. The massive ruins of Roman amphitheaters stood directly alongside the intricate medieval guild halls, all of it overshadowed by the stolid Prussian bureaucracy that now governed Trier with a heavy, unyielding hand. The sheer contradictions in the social and physical landscape piled up like the intricate vineyard terraces, ancient coexisting with the modern, the free living beside the fettered, the sacred next to the profane. Marx would dedicate his later career to dissecting exactly such contradictions, though he was clearly unable to have known his future path yet. For the moment, he was simply a bright, restless young man with a shock of thick, dark hair and a deep-seated restlessness that no quantity of local Rhine wine could ever soothe. His ambitious father dreamed that Karl would follow him and become a lawyer, a respectable, comfortable position, ensuring the continuation of the Marx family's hard-won bourgeois stability. But the boy who had matured intellectually between the covers of Enlightenment books and the shadow of Prussian censorship, between his Jewish familial roots and a practical Lutheran conversion, was already actively nursing questions that were simply too dangerous and subversive for any courtroom. In 1835, he finally left for university, carrying a heavy trunk of clothes, a head packed full of revolutionary ideas, and a heart primed and ready for rebellion. The quiet, comforting banks of the Moselle River would only see him sporadically after that. He was the prodigal son returning between stints of exile, each time a little more politically radical, a little more firmly convinced that the world urgently required not cautious, careful reform, but a sudden, dramatic, revolutionary change in its entire structure. The university years descended upon him like a sudden, chaotic storm, successfully shaking loose whatever faint bourgeois restraint still tentatively clung to the young Marx. The University of Bonn, which he entered in 1835, was renowned for its tavern brawls and the scars left by students' dueling clubs, a scene of vast distance from Trier's sleepy, predictable vineyards. The 18-year-old Karl dove in head first, immediately joining the Poets' Club, quickly running up considerable debts to purchase fine tailored coats and Spanish cigars, and even getting briefly arrested for simple drunkenness during one particularly rowdy night of carousing. His lawyer father's letters grew increasingly desperate and agitated, mixing stern financial reprimands with a deep, sincere paternal concern. "Your wild rampaging through the nocturnal streets," Heinrich wrote, "might perhaps be excused in a mere teenager, but certainly not in a future statesman." But Marx, as fate would have it, was not destined for statesmanship. By 1836, he had transferred his enrollment to Berlin, effectively trading the carefree Rhine wine for the city's Prussian austerity and rigid discipline. The University of Berlin's lecture halls possessed a distinct smell of fresh ink and pure ambition, and they hummed loudly with the influential, powerful ideas of Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. Hegel's complex philosophy, the core argument that history progresses only through dialectical clashes of opposing forces, electrified Marx's intellect. He quickly joined the young Hegelians, a notorious, radical circle of thinkers who took Hegel's analytical methods and, controversially, turned them directly against the Prussian state itself. Their nights blurred endlessly into days, spent in smoke-filled, dimly lit rooms where they intensely debated concepts like religion as the opium of the people and the monarchy as nothing more than an outdated, irrelevant relic. The transformation in Marx was genuinely startling. The law student who had initially arrived in Berlin with dreams of a respectable career was now furiously scribbling passionate poetry detailing hellish darkness and the downfall of the traditional gods. His father, watching this philosophical rebellion unfold through his son's increasingly erratic and verbose letters, became utterly frantic. "For God's sake," Heinrich pleaded in one missive, "when will you start living like a proper Christian and cease consorting with these atheistic intellectuals?" But Marx had already irrevocably slipped his leash. He stopped attending law lectures entirely, letting his official studies silently wither, while he instead devoured texts on philosophy, history, and economics with a ravenous hunger. By 1839, Marx was researching his doctoral thesis on ancient Greek materialism, a very sly, subtle rebuke to the idealist philosophy that was overwhelmingly dominating intellectual thought in Germany. He submitted it not to the politically conservative Berlin institution, but rather to the more liberal University of Jena, subsequently receiving his PhD in 1841 at the remarkably young age of 23. The newly minted Dr. Marx initially imagined a smooth academic career path, but the omnipresent Prussian government had starkly different ideas. When his influential mentor Bruno Bauer was summarily fired from his post for holding radical political views, Marx instantly understood that the university gates were now definitively closed to him. And so, the young philosopher stepped onto an entirely different, unpredictable path, a path that led not to ivory towers and lecture halls, but instead to radical journalism, tumultuous revolutionary politics, and, eventually, into the waiting, receptive arms of certain factory owner's son named Friedrich Engels. But that fateful meeting, like so many other future turning points, would simply have to wait. For the time being, Marx left Berlin with a degree he couldn't effectively use, a collection of ideas far too dangerous for the Prussian regime, and a surging restlessness that would carry him across the continent of Europe and deep into history. The party student was, inevitably, about to become a committed revolutionary. The occasional hangovers would certainly continue, but now they'd be consistently accompanied by something far more potent and compelling: a rising, intense fury at the world as it currently existed, and a burning, stubborn determination to fundamentally remake it. The ink-stained radical quickly found his first significant battleground not on the literal streets of the city, but rather within the pages of a struggling newspaper. The setting was Cologne, in the year 1842. Marx, now a focused 24-year-old and brimming with complex, untested theories, took on the helm of the Rheinische Zeitung. This liberal publication instantly became his intellectual laboratory. Each and every editorial piece he wrote was a carefully aimed, sharp dart directed squarely at Prussian authoritarianism. He wrote fiercely about the severe plight of the Moselle wine growers, who were being crushed by prohibitive taxes. He mocked the government censors who relentlessly redacted his published articles. And he slowly, deliberately honed his signature writing style, that powerful, unique mix of scholarly rigor and biting, sarcastic wit. The paper's circulation tripled under his dynamic leadership, much to the increasing dismay of the established government. But the Prussian patience was wearing dangerously thin. When Marx defended the fundamental right of peasants to be able to gather fallen wood from the forests controlled by the aristocrats, this was his first serious, deep engagement with the concept of property rights. The authorities pounced immediately. The newspaper was summarily shuttered in March 1843. Its final issue was dramatically printed entirely in bold red ink as a clear, defiant farewell gesture. Marx, now thoroughly blacklisted across all German states, faced a clear, binary choice: silence or exile. He chose exile with his typical dramatic flair, marrying his devoted sweetheart Jenny von Westphalen that summer before finally crossing the border into France. Paris in 1843 proved to be a major revelation. The very air smelled of incipient revolution and cheap pipe tobacco. Its numerous cafes buzzed with political exiles from every corner of Europe. Here, Marx discovered something the restrictive Prussian regime had never permitted: an open, vibrant space where truly radical ideas could breathe, flourish, and be discussed freely. He plunged headlong into the city's dense intellectual underground, spending long hours debating with anarchists and utopian socialists late into the night. It was during these fevered, intense months that Marx officially began his lifelong, ambitious project, systematically stripping away capitalism's highly polished, gleaming surface to expose the ugly, grinding machinery operating beneath. Late one evening, hunched intently over a desk in their cramped apartment, Marx showed Jenny his very latest notes. "These French thinkers," he muttered to his wife, "they certainly dream beautifully, but they are only constructing castles in the air." His fingers left smudges of ink on the page as he traced the complex connections between pure philosophy and practical economics, between abstract ideas and the actual workers who fundamentally moved history forward. Jenny, who was ever his first, most critical editor, gently pointed to a particularly dense, abstract passage. Too abstract, she wisely commented. If you truly want to change things, Karl, you'll need to speak directly to people's actual, lived experiences. That crucial lesson would permanently stay with Marx as Paris significantly sharpened his critical thinking. He subsequently co-founded the Deutsche Französische Jahrbucher, a radical theoretical journal that lasted for exactly one single issue before its Prussian sympathetic backers abruptly got cold feet. But that single, explosive issue contained Marx's seminal essay on the Jewish question, which marked his first major, decisive break from conventional liberal politics. The essay's startling, provocative conclusion: true, fundamental freedom required significantly more than just political rights. It urgently demanded the complete overthrow of the economic system that systematically alienated humans from the product of their own labor. As the harsh winter settled over Paris, Marx's famous beard grew thicker, and his critiques became notably sharper. Prussian spies carefully took note of the dangerous young German who was holding court at the Café de la Régence. By January 1845, the French government, having been pressured heavily by Berlin, officially issued an expulsion order. Marx once again packed his essential books, this time setting a course for Brussels, Belgium. He didn't yet know that his years of relentless wandering and permanent exile had only just begun in earnest. Nor could he possibly guess that his most fateful and consequential encounter with a sharp-eyed textile heir who had just published a scathing indictment of English factories was waiting right around the corner. The radical journalist was about to meet his other half. The critical encounter that would dramatically alter the course of world history happened almost by sheer accident. The place was Paris, in August 1844, specifically a cafe near the Rue Vanneau, where the air hung heavy with coffee steam and the low, intense murmur of revolutionary talk. Friedrich Engels, then just 24 years old, but already significantly hardened by 2 challenging years spent working in his father's Manchester textile firm, had deliberately sought Marx out after having enthusiastically read his yearbook's essays. Their initial meeting a year prior had been notably cool. Marx, the philosophical heavyweight, had initially dismissed the young businessman as merely just another utopian socialist. But this time, Engels arrived armed with something entirely irresistible: concrete, undeniable data. He gently slid a manuscript across the table. Its pages were smudged with genuine factory grime and ink. The condition of the working class in England laid bare the raw horrors Engels had personally witnessed. Young children with spines permanently curved from grueling 16-hour shifts at the machines. Workers coughing up lung-destroying lint from the toxic mill air. Entire families trading their dignity and health for mere pennies. Marx, who had previously theorized abstractly about alienation from the comfort of vast libraries, suddenly found himself staring directly at visceral, undeniable reality. As Engels spoke, his voice was low yet urgent, detailing wage slavery and the inner machinery of exploitation. And something profound clicked into place between them. We finished each other's sentences, Engels would later fondly recall. By the time of the last call at the cafe, they were actively plotting an intricate, lifelong collaboration. Their unusual partnership became the very engine of revolutionary theory. Engels, the practical observer who had upon his own boots to buy Marx's necessary ink, grounded Marx's abstract brilliance in concrete, factual detail. Marx, the relentless systematizer, skillfully transformed Engels's observations into sweeping, definitive historical analysis. Together, they wrote The Holy Family, a blistering literary takedown of their former young Hegelian friends. The intense writing sessions ran deep into the nights, fueled by cheap wine and Engels's seemingly bottomless supply of cigars. The only luxury I allow myself, he often joked, even though he would soon tragically inherit the very capitalist machinery that he personally despised. Jenny Marx, often watching silently from the doorway, would occasionally smile at the sight of her husband actually laughing for once, his usual brooding intensity lightened by Engels's dry, pragmatic wit. But their bond extended beyond mere intellect. When Marx was expelled from Paris in 1845, Engels followed him immediately to Brussels without any hesitation, despite being then just a clerk living on mere scraps from his father's generosity. Later, when he became a factory partner, Engels would act as Marx's reluctant, necessary lifeline, quietly funneling large portions of his bourgeois income to the family that was denouncing the bourgeoisie in print. Someone had to make money, Engels famously sighed, and it certainly wasn't going to be Karl. And when the two men felt the urgent need to test their developing theories against real-world reality, they embarked on a 6-week tour of the most notorious English industrial slums. Manchester's textile mills literally became their classroom. The sheer, crushing misery they witnessed there hardened their conviction that capitalism was not just flawed, but fundamentally doomed to collapse. By 1847, their collective ideas had crystallized sufficiently to attract the attention of the small group known as the League of the Just. At a London pub called the Red Lion, Marx and Engels rewrote the League's manifesto into something much sharper, fiercer, and more scientific. As Engels slowly paced the floor and read the draft aloud, the assembled workers leaned forward, fully captivated. The document's famous final line, "Workers of the world, unite," wasn't just simple rhetoric. It was a battle cry literally forged in the space between Marx's philosophical fire and Engels's first-hand knowledge of economic oppression. The theorist and the witness, the rebel and his reluctant banker. A partnership that had begun over a simple cafe table would ultimately go on to shake vast empires, funded, with supreme irony, by the very system it sought to destroy. The League of the Just had been whispering about the prospect of revolution for years, a scattered, clandestine network of German exiles and disgruntled tailors meeting in hidden London backrooms. But when Marx and Engels arrived in 1847, carrying their new manifesto draft, the whispers exploded into a unified roar. The group swiftly renamed itself the Communist League, intentionally shedding its old conspiratorial mysticism for something bolder, clearer, a scientific blueprint for class warfare. That winter in Brussels, Marx's cramped apartment became the League's unwavering, unofficial headquarters. Jenny Marx, now deeply involved, served cups of tea to a rotating cast of shoemakers and printers while her husband paced the room, dictating passages that would eventually coalesce into the Communist Manifesto. Engels, ever the meticulous editor, deftly trimmed Marx's dense Germanic sentences into razor-sharp, accessible prose. A specter is haunting Europe. Marx began one midnight, pausing as Engels quickly scribbled a marginal note, too poetic. Yet the phrase remained, its ominous rhythm proving perfect for the coming political storm. The manifesto itself was less a book than an intellectual detonation, just 23 pages that fundamentally reduced all of human history to a single, powerful law. The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. It painted capitalism as a vampiric, unsustainable system, surprisingly praised the bourgeoisie for its revolutionary destruction of feudalism, but then immediately declared its inevitable, necessary collapse. The writing crackled with caustic, vibrant wit. The bourgeoisie has stripped of its halo every occupation hitherto honored. It has converted the physician, the lawyer, the priest into its paid wage laborers. When the Revolution of 1848 dramatically erupted in Paris, toppling the monarchy in 3 chaotic days, the manifesto suddenly seemed profoundly prophetic. Marx, who had been swiftly expelled from Brussels, raced back to Paris just as exiled German radicals were hailing him as their chief theorist. By April, he had launched a new radical paper in Cologne, the Neue Rheinische Zeitung, explicitly urging German workers to push beyond mere bourgeois reforms. Engels, ever the soldier philosopher, even took up arms with revolutionary fighters in Bonn. But the political tide turned rapidly. By 1849, Prussian troops had decisively crushed the rebellions. Marx's newspaper was shut down, its final issue again printed in defiant red ink. Facing immediate arrest, he fled to London with Jenny, who was then pregnant with their 4th child, and only what little remained of their possessions. Engels, after a harrowing escape through Switzerland, soon followed. As they regrouped in a damp, miserable Soho tenement, the full scale of their failure became painfully clear. The revolutions had utterly collapsed. The Communist League was in tatters, and their powerful manifesto had sold a mere 100 copies in total. Yet, in that cramped, desolate exile, something curious and powerful began to happen. The pamphlet began circulating underground, stealthily smuggled into Germany, hidden within bales of cotton, and passed hand to hand in French worker circles. A text written in great haste was slowly but surely becoming scripture for a new global movement that was only just beginning to stir. Marx couldn't possibly have known then that his pamphlet's most famous lines would one day echo in every language on earth. For now, there was only the damp London cold, the cries of his malnourished children, and the slow, stubborn, agonizing work of thinking a new world into existence. London in the 1850s greeted the impoverished Marx family like a damp, persistent, unrelenting cough. Their 2-room flat in Soho's Dean Street smelled perpetually of stale bread and wet wool, and the walls were so impossibly thin that they could clearly hear their neighbors' arguments verbatim. Marx, now stateless and completely penniless, spent his mornings trudging through the perpetual fog to the British Museum's reading room, a temple of knowledge where he could at least warm his frozen fingers while intensely studying parliamentary reports on factory conditions. The museum attendants knew him simply as that German doctor who reliably occupied the same seat from opening until closing, consistently surrounded by teetering stacks of books, his marginal notes growing increasingly furious as he traced the harsh veins of capitalism through dry, dense economic data. At home, the grim reality was far worse. 3 of their young children, Guido, Francisca, and Edgar, would tragically die in those years, victims of severe malnutrition and the tuberculosis that relentlessly flourished in London's crowded tenements. Marx often had to pawn his own coat in winter just to buy medicine for the surviving children, then would sit shivering intensely as he wrote analytical articles for the New York Tribune under the pseudonym A London Correspondent, ironic dispatches about European politics that paid just enough to keep the relentless bailiffs temporarily at bay. Jenny, once the daughter of a respected Prussian aristocrat, bravely learned to stretch a single loaf of bread across 3 difficult days, her hands red and raw from scrubbing clothes in the shared communal wash tub. Yet, it was in this private, relentless darkness that Marx was painstakingly assembling what would eventually become his life's masterpiece. The sheer scale of his economic research during this time was astonishing. He was consuming reports from every factory district, analyzing tax data, charting the price of goods, and developing his core theory of surplus value, the hidden mechanism of capitalist exploitation. The reading room became his crucible, forging his immense theory of political economy in the fires of personal and political failure. The notes he meticulously scribbled in the museum, pages filled with complex equations diligently tracking cotton prices alongside figures detailing worker starvation rates, were the very first essential threads of capital. He wrote in a frenzy of intense concentration, often standing upright at his desk to fight off sleep, while the frail coughs of his children constantly drifted through the thin, miserable walls of their dwelling. When little Edgar tragically died in 1855, Marx deeply buried his immense grief in work, famously telling Engels, "I must save what can still be saved." The manuscript grew haltingly, in fits and starts, constantly interrupted by the painful boils on his skin, nervous eruptions stemming from chronic stress, and by squabbles with other exiled revolutionaries who unfairly accused him of abandoning practical political engagement for the sake of abstract, dense theory. Through all the hardship, Engels remained a steadfast lifeline. His monthly remittances, Marx's sardonic, ironic term for the money, arrived like reliable clockwork, even though Engels himself was trapped in Manchester, managing the family firm that he fundamentally loathed. Their constant correspondence vividly chronicled the absurd duality of their joint lives. Engels describing the textile profits that were literally funding Marx's London rent, while Marx, in turn, detailed his latest discoveries about surplus value, the hidden, systemic theft embedded within every industrialist ledger book. By 1857, a sudden global financial crash sent Marx rushing back to the museum with a palpable, renewed urgency. "The deluge is coming," he excitedly wrote to Engels, convinced that capitalism's internal contradictions would finally and definitively explode. Instead, the robust system adapted, the closed factories slowly reopened, and Marx, still unpublished and unknown, found himself once again at square one. But something crucial had shifted in those years of quiet, intellectual desperation. The man who decisively emerged from the 1850s was no longer the fiery young journalist, but a profound, meticulous scholar who had stared into capital's abyss and successfully begun mapping its precise contours. The first definitive volume of Capital still remained unfinished, its pages heavily stained with tea and pipe tobacco. But its central, searing insight now burned with perfect clarity, that the whole economic system rested on a simple, brutal alchemy, the conversion of human sweat into industrial gold, of living labor into dead capital. And Marx, the eternal exile, would dedicate the remainder of his strenuous life to documenting that systemic crime in meticulous, world-shattering detail. By the 1860s, Marx had evolved into a permanent, recognizable fixture of the British Museum's reading room, the shaggy, ink-stained specter haunting the economic section. The long-suffering attendants knew his exact routine well. Arrive at the opening bell, claim seat 07, demand the latest factory inspection reports, and scribble furious notes until his writing hands invariably cramped. His signature beard had gone gray, his cough had worsened by London's legendary pea soup fog, but his mind burned hotter and sharper than ever. On the desk before him, a monstrous manuscript grew, like some unholy, theoretical cross between a rigorous PhD thesis and a political Molotov cocktail. Its name was Das Kapital. Its ambitious mission, to formally autopsy capitalism down to its final, twitching, bloodless heart. The writing process was an equal mix of scholarly rigor and sheer slapstick tragedy. Marx's chronic carbuncles, those painful, large boils plaguing him since the 1850s, flared up whenever he sat too long, forcing him to write standing up like some Victorian-era standing desk enthusiast. His letters to Engels often read like a hypochondriac's detailed diary. The damned boils have migrated to my ass, making both thinking and sitting equally impossible. Meanwhile, Jenny consistently pawned the remaining family silver to buy paper, while little Eleanor Marx, age 6, practiced her letters by copying out passages about the concept of commodity fetishism. Domestic life had become a bizarre, unstable blend of bourgeois routine and revolutionary fervor. Breakfast conversations might abruptly veer from little Laura's piano lessons to the precise rate at which factory owners were sucking the life out of the workers. Capital wasn't so much written as exhumed. Each crucial chapter was mined from over 20 years of intense, detailed research. Marx filled it with Gothic horror stories of industrial England, children's bones softening from phosphorus fumes, seamstresses collapsing after 30-hour shifts, entire poor families literally living in workhouse coffins, some London shelters truly rented out wooden boxes for a penny a night. He deployed sarcasm like a precise surgical scalpel, dedicating pages to mocking the theological niceties of economists who treated markets as natural, inevitable laws rather than as mere human social inventions. The book's central, powerful metaphor, capital as a vampire draining living labor, wasn't just empty rhetoric. It was the scream of a man who'd spent far too many nights reading factory inspectors' reports by flickering gaslight. When Volume I was finally published in 1867, the initial silence was deafening. The first print run of 1,000 copies simply gathered dust in Hamburg warehouses. The Times of London ignored it completely. Even fellow socialists grumbled about its immense density. Auguste Bebel complained it gave him headaches. Only Engels truly grasped its explosive potential, writing fake, promotional reviews in German papers to artificially drum up interest, a guerrilla marketing campaign of high-level intellectual effort. Slowly, improbably, it began to find its audience. Self-taught factory workers in Leipzig, passing its equations around after exhausting shifts. Russian nihilists cleverly smuggling copies past the Tsar's censors. Even the odd, curious bourgeois reader who, presumably, simply needed help sleeping. The few critics who did engage completely missed the point. One German reviewer praised Marx's fine literary style while utterly dismissing his economics, like complimenting a guillotine's polished blade. Others stubbornly fixated on his supposed materialism, overlooking the profound and often grim human story intrinsically woven into his economic arguments. Beneath all the complex data, Marx was charting a system he viewed as inherently unstable, marked by widespread alienation and predictable cycles of crisis, and one that he firmly believed carried the seeds of its own eventual, momentous change. Through it all, Marx kept revising, expanding, and, in classic Marx fashion, procrastinating. Volumes 2 and 3 existed only as chaotic drafts, their pages littered with digressions about medieval land rights and the chemical composition of fertilizer. He'd promise Engels just 6 more weeks of edits, then disappeared down intellectual rabbit holes for months, emerging with 50 new pages on cotton spinning techniques, but 0 completed chapters. The project became his white whale, his King Lear, his never-ending chess game against an economic system that kept changing the rules of engagement. And yet, for all its unfinished state, Capital achieved something remarkable. It made the invisible visible, transforming the mundane horrors of factory life into evidence of a system fundamentally built on stolen time. When Manchester textile workers began quoting its passages at union meetings, when German socialists used its formulas to calculate fair wages, Marx allowed himself a rare moment of genuine pride. The book that began as a whisper in the British Museum was rapidly becoming a weapon, one that would outlive its author, its first readers, and even the 19th century itself. The monster was loose and starting to roar. London, September 28, 1864. A large, significant public meeting was convened at St. Martin's Hall in Long Acre, the air buzzing with both anticipation and the fervent discussions of a diverse, multinational assembly. French Prudentists, Italian Republicans, British trade unionists, and German exiles, whose revolutionary zeal had never waned since 1848, gathered, all championing workers' rights in a medley of languages and accents. Karl Marx was a pivotal figure in attendance, soon to become the leading intellectual mind of the International Working Men's Association, the First International, history's very first socialist supergroup, which was officially founded at this very event. The First International was born from equal parts idealism and sheer desperation. European workers were being crushed mercilessly between the gears of industrial capitalism. English textile mills were paying starvation wages. French miners were living like moles underground. German children were tragically losing fingers in the heavy factory machinery. Marx, now playing the role of elder statesman at 46, recognized a clear opportunity. "We must become the generals of the working class," he told Engels, though neither man had ever held a gun in anger. The plan? Unite every radical faction under a single, cohesive banner. The problem? Radicals generally hate unity almost as much as they despise capitalists. Marx's true genius was in making the International's founding documents vague enough to please absolutely everyone. The statutes simply promised the emancipation of the working classes without ever specifying the exact how. The inaugural address, penned by Marx in a single, intense, caffeine-fueled night, powerfully denounced capitalism with Shakespearean flair. The misery of the working masses has not diminished from 1848 to 1864, while carefully avoiding politically charged words like revolution or dictatorship. It was revolutionary politics as a Rorschach test. French anarchists saw decentralized communes. British trade unionists saw better wages. And Marx saw the unfolding seeds of his scientific socialism. For a few glorious years, it actually worked. The International became a clearinghouse for labor unrest across the European continent. When Paris bronze workers went on strike, London dockers sent crucial funds. When Swiss factory owners cut wages, German pamphlets mysteriously appeared in workers' lunch pails. Marx, the nominal head of this ragtag empire, spent his days endlessly mediating between the warring factions while secretly maneuvering to purge anarchists from the ranks. His arch-nemesis, Mikhail Bakunin, a bear-sized Russian anarchist who believed in spontaneous uprisings and allegedly ate 12 raw eggs for breakfast, became his biggest obstacle. Their ideological feud played out in increasingly petty, vitriolic letters. Marx mocking Bakunin's childish plans. Bakunin calling Marx a slippery Jew. The whole fragile experiment came crashing down in 1872 when Marx essentially pulled a corporate takeover. Fearing Bakunin's faction would gain too much control, he had the International's headquarters moved to New York, the 19th century equivalent of transferring your rival's department to Antarctica. The organization limped along for 4 more years before dissolving, bankrupt and irreparably divided. Yet, Like most of Marx's perceived failures, the First International left indelible fingerprints everywhere. It proved workers could successfully organize across national borders. It turned crucial terms like proletariat and bourgeoisie into household words, and it provided the world with the original leftist infighting playbook. Every socialist schism since, from Trotskyist versus Stalinist to today's various progressive divisions, owes something to those smoke-filled London rooms. Marx himself was characteristically unsentimental about the collapse. "The International has done its work," he shrugged, already elbow-deep in notes for Capital's next volume. Besides, history had a funny way of resurrecting his projects when least expected. Within months, Parisian workers would rise up in the Commune, and suddenly, everyone would be quoting Marx again. Paris, March 1871. The besieged city smells of gunpowder and fresh-baked bread, an unlikely combination that perfectly captures the surreal, dangerous moment. The workers have seized control. This wasn't through some carefully plotted Marxist revolution, but rather because the official French government had literally fled, abandoning the capital to the Prussians and its own frustrated citizens. What emerges as history's first workers' state, the Paris Commune, a chaotic, passionate experiment in radical, direct democracy, where waiters debate economics in City Hall and artists redesign the school curriculum. Our bearded theorist in London nearly chokes on his tea when he hears the news. After decades of predicting proletarian revolution, here it was unfolding spontaneously, messily, and completely contrary to his detailed expectations. The communards hadn't read Capital. It was still barely selling, hadn't waited for historical conditions to ripen, and hadn't even bothered to consult him. For 2 intense months, Marx oscillated between intellectual exhilaration and sheer panic, firing off letters to Paris that invariably arrived too late to matter. The Commune's innovations read like a socialist fever dream. Factories seized and immediately turned into worker cooperatives. Church property redistributed. The standing army abolished. A Hungarian midwife turned revolutionary. Natalie Lemmel organized free communal kitchens. A radical school teacher, Louise Michel, led women's battalions to the barricades. The Louvre temporarily became a political club where artists debated workers' rights. It was everything Marx theorized about and nothing like he imagined. Back in London, Engels paced their cramped study, gleefully updating battle maps, as if watching a particularly exciting football match. "They're holding Montmartre," he crowed one day, only to groan the next. "The Versailles troops have retaken the cannons." Marx, meanwhile, scribbled furious notes for what would become the Civil War in France, his definitive analysis of the unfolding drama. His writing captured the Commune's tragic beauty, the glorious harbinger of a new society, even as he knew exactly how this story had to end. And oh, how brutally it ended. In May, the French government troops stormed Paris with a brutality that shocked even veteran war correspondents. The cobblestones ran red as some 20,000 communards were executed in a single, devastating week. Women were gunned down, clutching their children. Radicals were lined up against the mortar faders and shot so efficiently that the wall still stands today, pockmarked with bullet holes. Witnesses claimed the Seine River flowed crimson for days. When the heavy smoke finally cleared, Marx's pamphlet became required reading for radicals worldwide. His description of the Commune as the finally discovered political form under which to work out the economic emancipation of labor was quoted in every revolutionary circle from St. Petersburg to Chicago. But privately, he was shaken. The workers had their chance, and they were massacred for it. The old man spent weeks staring at Parisian newspapers, tracing the execution lists with trembling fingers. The legacy of those 72 days would haunt socialist movements forever. Lenin would study the Commune's mistakes obsessively before 1917. Mao would cite its example. Even today, the phrase Paris Commune conjures both revolutionary romance and brutal caution. It was proof that workers could govern themselves, and proof of what happens when they try to do so prematurely. As for our London exile, he was left with a profound paradox. History had finally followed his script, only to rewrite the ending in blood. The next revolution, he realized with heavy certainty, would need more than just barricades and good intentions. It would urgently need an army of its own, prepared for the consequences. The 1870s arrived like a slow-motion avalanche of bad news. Marx's physical body was falling apart. His lungs wheezed like broken bellows. His skin erupted in angry boils, and his liver had apparently declared medical independence. The revolutionary who once wrote of capitalism's inevitable collapse now spent far more time discussing his own inevitable collapse with a rotating cast of quack doctors. "I am a machine condemned to devour books," he groaned to Engels, "and now the damn machine is breaking down." Jenny's cough worried him the most. His wife of nearly 40 years, the Prussian aristocrat who chose exile and poverty beside him, now moved through their London home like a silent ghost. The woman who once hosted Europe's radicals in her parlor, while quietly pawning the family silver, could barely climb the stairs without gasping for breath. Marx read her old letters when he couldn't sleep, the passionate notes from their youth, the frantic ones from their early exile years. And he pretended not to notice the blood-stained handkerchiefs she desperately hid in her sewing basket. Work became his only refuge. The British Museum attendants had grown accustomed to the sight of the shaggy, old revolutionary limping to his usual seat, muttering about that idiot Bakunin under his breath. Volume 2 of Capital languished in draft form, its pages a chaotic mix of economic formulas and ranting marginalia, typical bourgeois nonsense. He had become the grand old man of socialism without ever fully finishing his masterpiece. The movement he inspired kept evolving without his permission. German socialists were winning Reichstag seats through elections rather than uprisings. Russian radicals wrote to him as if he were the Oracle of Delphi, asking whether peasant communes could skip capitalism entirely. Even the English press treated him with a strange new respect. The Times ran a profile calling him the most feared thinker in Europe, which at least beat being ignored. Then came the hammer blow, Jenny's death in December 1881. Marx was simply too ill to attend the funeral. He lay in bed, listening to the rain patter against the window as they buried the woman who was his first editor, fiercest defender, and last tether to bourgeois respectability. When he finally visited the grave months later, he collapsed into his daughter Eleanor's arms, sobbing so violently the cemetery attendants looked away. "The Moor is dead, too," Engels told friends afterward, using Marx's family nickname. The end came 2 years later, in that familiar armchair by the fire. A housekeeper found him slumped over, a half-written page on his lap. Yet another note about the Russian peasantry. The death certificate listed bronchitis and pleurisy. But anyone who knew him understood the real cause. 40 years of exile, grief, and 16-hour workdays will burn through even the toughest revolutionary machine. At the funeral in Highgate Cemetery, Engels delivered the eulogy to 11 mourners. "His name will endure through the ages," he promised, though the London papers barely noted the passing of this notorious agitator. The tombstone bears no mention of manifestos or revolutions, just that famous final call to action. "Workers of all lands, unite. Back in the empty house on Maitland Park Road, Engels opened the dreaded notebooks. 2 unfinished volumes of Capital stared back at him in near indecipherable scrawl. The chaotic legacy of history's most meticulous critic of chaos. The old soldier sighed, rolled up his sleeves, and reached for the whiskey. The revolution, it seemed, would first require an editor. The ink was barely dry on Marx's tombstone when the canonization began. 1880s Europe, groaning under the immense weight of industrial capitalism's excesses, suddenly found itself crawling with Marxists, or at least people who called themselves Marxists, in London pubs, German beer halls, and Russian study circles. Arguments erupted over what the old man really meant. Engels, now the keeper of the sacred texts, spent his days fielding letters from fanatics and skeptics alike. No, he wrote for the 100th time to some overeager French socialist. Karl did not predict the revolution would arrive next Tuesday. The movement Marx left behind was splitting at the seams like a cheap suit. In Germany, Eduard Bernstein argued capitalism could be reformed through parliament, earning himself the nickname Evolutionary Eddie from more radical comrades. In Russia, a young firebrand named Lenin pored over capital in Siberian exile, scribbling notes about how to skip the whole bourgeois democracy stage entirely. Meanwhile, anarchists and utopians kept trying to claim Marx's legacy, much to Engels' irritation. It's like watching children divide up an inheritance before the will's even been read, he grumbled to a friend. By the 1890s, Marx's ideas were undergoing the ultimate, profound irony, becoming respectable. German Social Democrats won Reichstag seats using his rhetoric. British Fabians quoted him at tea parties. Even the odd, brave professor began teaching capital, though usually with the disclaimer that it was purely academic. The books that had gathered dust in warehouses now went through multiple printings, their margins filled with workers' pencil marks. Those first edition copies Engels had hawked like snake oil now sold for a small fortune to collectors. The real turning point came in 1895 when Engels published Volume 3 of Capital, a Frankenstein's monster of a book stitched together from decades of notes. Critics pounced on its apparent contradictions, not realizing they were truly arguing with a ghost. Marx's theories about capitalism's inevitable collapse suddenly seemed less convincing during Europe's major economic boom. The old mole has gone blind, crowed one bourgeois newspaper. But history had a funny way of vindicating Marx just when everyone counted him out. The 1905 Russian Revolution, though crushed, proved workers could rise up, and Lenin's faction took careful notes. By 1914, the movement faced its greatest moral test. When European socialist parties abandoned international solidarity to support their nation's war efforts, it seemed Marx's dream of worker unity had died in the trenches. But in Zurich, a certain bold revolutionary pored over the Communist Manifesto and saw opportunity in the carnage. Imperialism is capitalism's highest stage, Lenin wrote, giving Marx's theories a fresh coat of paint for the new century. Then came 1917, when the Bolsheviks stormed the Winter Palace. They did it under Marx's banner, literally. His face adorned their posters. His phrases filled their decrees. The man who'd spent his life as a penniless exile was now the patron saint of a workers' state. Back in Highgate Cemetery, someone placed a wreath on the grave inscribed, "Your theory became reality." Engels, had he lived to see it, might have wept or possibly face-palmed, because this wasn't exactly what they had envisioned. The revolution had come not in advanced industrial Germany, but backward, peasant-filled Russia. The dictatorship of the proletariat looked suspiciously like, well, a dictatorship. and Marx's careful critique of capitalism was being turned into state dogma, complete with heresy trials for anyone who interpreted it differently. The ghost in the machine was loose, and nobody, not the capitalists, not the socialists, certainly not the dead philosopher himself, could control where it went next. The 20th century didn't so much embrace Marx's ideas as violently wrestle with them in full public view. After the Russian Revolution, his bearded visage went global, staring sternly from Soviet banners, glaring from Cuban billboards, even making cameos in Chinese opera adaptations. Meanwhile, Western governments developed a nervous tic every time someone mentioned dialectical materialism. The Cold War wasn't just missiles and spies. It was the world's most intense book club debate gone horrifically wrong. In Moscow, Marx became less a thinker than a sacred icon. The Institute of Marxism-Leninism employed hundreds of scholars to produce definitive editions of his works and definitive interpretations to match. Woe betide any comrade who suggested capital might contain a single contradiction. Stalin, not known for his scholarly patience, reportedly kept a well-thumbed copy by his bedside, though whether he actually read it or just used it to flatten insects remains a debated point. The West responded with equal parts hysteria and appropriation. FBI agents infiltrated college Marxist study groups, only to discover they mostly involved undergraduates arguing about alienation over bad coffee. Hollywood pumped out anti-communist propaganda films where square-jawed capitalists rescued workers from evil Bolsheviks, never noticing how perfectly this confirmed Marxist theories about ideology serving power. Even Disney got in on the act, producing an animated short where a cheerful American squirrel outwitted a gloomy Marxist owl. Yet some of the most interesting developments came from thinkers trapped between these political poles. In an Italian prison, Antonio Gramsci filled notebooks with theories about cultural hegemony, how ruling classes maintain power not just through force, but by controlling what gets called common sense. In Germany, the Frankfurt School completely reinvented Marxist critique for the age of radio and advertising, while carefully avoiding any mention of actually overthrowing governments, their reward being denounced by Stalinists and McCarthyists alike, a rare case of bipartisan disapproval. By the 1960s, Marx's ideas had escaped the ivory tower and the Politburo. Young French students scrawled his phrases on Parisian walls during May '68. Black Panthers distributed copies of the Communist Manifesto alongside breakfast programs. Even mainstream economists begrudgingly admitted he'd been right about capitalism's boom-bust cycles, if wrong about its imminent demise. The ultimate irony came when Wall Street firms started hiring Marxist analysts to predict the next crisis, proving yet again that capitalism could commodify absolutely anything, even its own gravediggers. Through it all, the old divisions persisted. Soviet bloc Marxists dismissed Western revisionists as bourgeois apologists. Western Marxists sneered at Soviet dogmatists for turning living theory into state religion. And actual workers, the people Marx wrote about, often found both camps equally incomprehensible. The prophet, who predicted history would be decided by class struggle, might have been amused to see it devolve into academic squabbles and propaganda wars. Or perhaps he'd just sigh, light another cigar, and get back to work. After all, the contradictions kept piling up faster than anyone could analyze them. The 21st century was widely supposed to bury Marx for good. With the Soviet Union dissolved and China boldly embracing socialism with capitalist characteristics, even his most devoted followers began nervously updating their resumes. But history, that sly dialectician, had entirely other plans. As the new millennium fully unfolded, The old theorist staged a comeback so improbable it would make a Hollywood producer blush, not as a dusty revolutionary icon, but as the patron saint of disaffected millennials, overworked gig workers, and anyone who'd ever stared at their Uber rating with a cold, existential dread. The Great Recession of 2008 served as Marx's unlikely revival tour. As colossal Wall Street banks collapsed and governments bailed out billionaires, something truly peculiar occurred. Sales of capital spiked by 400%. Suddenly, everyone from Occupy Wall Street protesters to befuddled economics professors found themselves thumbing through the same dense Victorian prose that had gathered dust for decades. The irony was utterly delicious. The very financial institutions Marx had predicted would self-destruct were now inadvertently driving people to his foundational work. Bookstores reported executives were buying copies in plain brown wrappers, like Victorian gentlemen purchasing risque French novels. Academia underwent its own Marxist makeover. Gender studies departments dissected social reproduction theory. Who changes all those diapers and cooks all those meals that keep workers well working? Environmental scientists applied his concept of metabolic rift to the rapidly worsening climate change crisis. Even business schools, those temples of global capitalism, begrudgingly admitted his incisive analysis of boom-bust cycles might have merit, though they carefully avoided mentioning the whole, overthrow the system part, the ultimate indignity. Economics Nobel laureates started casually dropping Marxian terms like commodity fetishism at Davos cocktail parties, much to the horror of their hedge fund hosts. Hollywood, never one for subtlety, turned Marx into a cultural Rorschach test. Superhero movies featured villainousy, prestige dramas depicted Marxist professors as either heroic truth-tellers or unhinged radicals, depending on the network. The piece de resistance came when a streaming service greenlit the Marx and Engels Variety Hour, a surreal sketch comedy show that somehow made primitive accumulation funny. Critics dubbed it Monty Python for the Theory Bro set. Then came the internet, where Marx found his true digital afterlife. Memes about late capitalism proliferated, juxtaposing $15 avocado toast with images of Victorian workhouses. TikTok videos explained alienation theory through skits about influencer culture. Someone even created a Marxist critique of cryptocurrency, so insightful it went viral before the inevitable NFT bubble burst. The revolution might not be televised, but it was definitely getting live-tweeted and memed. The workplace became Marx's most unexpected battleground. Tech workers formed Marxist reading groups in Silicon Valley break rooms. Amazon warehouse employees circulated dog-eared copies of Capital alongside union organizing pamphlets. Even Wall Street got in on the act. Hedge funds hired Marxist analysts to predict the next crisis, proving capitalism could commodify absolutely anything, even its own gravediggers. The most surreal moment came when workers at a Berlin startup unionized using an app called Class Consciousness 2.0, complete with push notifications about surplus value extraction. Through it all, Marx's specter haunted the contradictions of modern life. His face adorned everything from high-end streetwear to protest banners. His phrases were quoted equally by tenured radicals and algorithmic trading bots. The system he'd sought to overthrow had instead absorbed him, effectively turning revolutionary critique into just another lifestyle brand. Whether this represented capitalism's ultimate triumph or its most delicious, self-cannibalizing contradiction depended entirely on who you asked. As the 2020s rolled on, with climate catastrophe looming and inequality reaching Gilded Age levels, Marx's core questions felt more urgent than ever. The answers, however, remained as elusive as they'd been in 1848. One thing was certain. The old mole of history was still digging, and this time he had Wi-Fi. The man who'd once written in near isolation would have marveled at seeing his ideas debated by millions online, though he'd probably hate the ads. For all his penetrating brilliance, Marx left behind a minefield of unanswered questions and unintended consequences, the intellectual equivalent of a revolutionary IED that kept detonating in unexpected places. The man who saw capitalism's flaws with crystal clarity somehow missed how nationalism would ultimately trump class solidarity, how consumer culture would absorb dissent like a sponge, and how his own phrases would be weaponized by regimes he might have despised. The 20th century became a brutal stress test for his theories, leaving behind a trail of paradoxes that continue to haunt us today. Take the dictatorship of the proletariat, perhaps Marx's most unfortunate turn of phrase. What he envisioned as a temporary workers' democracy became, in practice, justification for totalitarian one-party states from Moscow to Pyongyang. The results were grim enough to make even devoted Marxists wince. Show trials conducted in the name of dialectical materialism, gulags justified as re-education, and 5-year plans that somehow never quite reached year 6. The bitter irony? These so-called Marxist states often resembled the worst excesses of industrial capitalism, exploitative, hierarchical, and obsessed with production targets, just with more red flags and worse fashion. Then there was Marx's blind spot for nationalism. The man who declared workers have no country failed to predict how easily ethnic identity would override class consciousness. Polish workers sided with Polish capitalists against Russian socialists. Vietnamese peasants fought French colonizers before turning on their own bourgeoisie. Even the international socialist movement fractured along national lines when World War I broke out. German Marxists cheering for the Kaiser, French Marxists defending the Republic. The proletariat, it turned out, rather liked having countries. Capitalism's adaptability proved another major miscalculation. Marx assumed the system would collapse under its own contradictions, not that it would learn a profit from those very contradictions. The same alienation he decried became a marketing strategy. Authentic experiences sold to desk workers craving meaning. The commodification he analyzed now extended to revolutionary aesthetics itself, with Che Guevara's face on t-shirts and Das Kapital marketed as a designer coffee table book. Even class struggle got gentrified. Brooklyn activists hashtagging #resistance while sipping $8 lattes. Perhaps most surprisingly, Marx underestimated how thoroughly capitalism could buy off segments of the working class. The mid-20th century saw Western factory workers trading revolutionary fervor for suburban homes and color TVs. What one Marxist theorist bitterly called the proletariat becoming petty bourgeois without ceasing to be proletarian. Union bosses negotiated better wages while leaving the system intact. The revolutionary subject Marx pinned his hopes on seemed to vanish just as the contradictions grew sharper. Yet for all these oversights, Marx's core insights kept returning like repressed memories. Every financial crisis revived interest in his analysis of capitalism's inherent instability. Every new technology, from assembly lines to algorithms, brought fresh waves of alienation. Even his much-mocked prediction about capitalism's tendency toward monopoly looked prescient as tech giants gobbled up entire industries. The old contradictions kept resurfacing in new forms, like a game of ideological whack-a-mole. The greatest testament to Marx's legacy might be this. After 150 years of failed predictions, brutal regimes invoking his name, and capitalism's endless reinventions, we still can't stop arguing about him. Conservatives blame him for everything from postmodernism to bad campus poetry. Leftists debate which of his ideas remain salvageable. Even centrists grudgingly admit he diagnosed problems they're still trying to solve with policy tweaks. The theorist who wanted to change the world instead became, in the end, Marx's most enduring contribution might be the questions he left unanswered. How do we build a just economy without creating new oppressions? Can technology liberate workers instead of surveilling them? Is collective dignity possible without crushing individual freedom? These aren't just theoretical puzzles. They're the live wires sparking through every protest movement, policy debate, and late-night dorm room argument. Today, the old revolutionary might not have had the definitive solutions, but he framed the problems with terrifying clarity. And in an age of climate crisis, algorithmic control, and yawning inequality, those problems won't be going away anytime soon. If the old revolutionary were to materialize in our world today, perhaps summoned by the collective frustration of gig workers or the eerie glow of cryptocurrency mining farms, he'd find both his wildest predictions and worst nightmares coming true in equal measure. The 21st century has become a funhouse mirror version of his prophecies. Billionaires launching themselves into space while their workers struggle to afford insulin. Artificial intelligence threatening to make human labor obsolete. And climate change proving that capitalism's externalities might just kill us all. The contradictions he identified haven't been resolved. They've metastasized into weirder, more virulent forms. Take the modern workplace. Marx wrote about alienation in Victorian factories, but even he couldn't have imagined the surreal detachment of today's digital labor. The Uber driver rated below 4.8 stars. The content moderator traumatized by filtering beheading videos for minimum wage. The Amazon warehouse worker timed during bathroom breaks by algorithms that don't need sleep or health care. Exploitation has become so abstracted that workers often never see their actual employers. Just apps, metrics, and the occasional passive-aggressive notification from a void. The factory is in your pocket. The foreman is an AI. And the proletariat has been rebranded as independent contractors. Then there's the spectacle of modern consumption, which would make Marx's head spin. The same workers being squeezed by late capitalism are drowning in its cheap comforts. Endless streaming content to numb the stress of precarious employment. Fast fashion to mask the stagnating wages. Viral challenges distracting from the erosion of labor rights. Alienation has been commodified and sold back to us as self-care. Even revolutionary impulses get repackaged. The activists fight the system, slogan printed on sweatshop-made t-shirts. The anti-capitalist manifesto available for next-day prime delivery. Climate change presents the most brutal confirmation of Marx's ecological foresight. His concept of metabolic rift. Capitalism's tendency to rupture humanity's relationship with nature reads like a blueprint for our current crisis. The same system that treats workers as disposable also treats the planet as an infinite resource and bottomless waste dump. The ultimate irony? Those feeling the consequences first and hardest are the very working-class communities Marx championed, while the billionaire class builds apocalypse bunkers in New Zealand. Yet for all this bleak confirmation of his theories, our world would baffle Marx in crucial ways. The working class has fractured into a kaleidoscope of identities and interests. Traditional factories have given way to app-based gig work, making collective action harder to organize. The very concept of labor is blurring. Is a TikTok creator a worker or a micro-entrepreneur? A programmer training AI models a proletarian or part of the machine? Perhaps most surprisingly, Marx might be stunned by capitalism's cultural victory. His assumption that immiseration would lead inevitably to revolution failed to account for how effectively discontent could be channeled into consumerism and culture wars. The same algorithms that exploit workers also feed them personalized distractions. The anger that might have fueled class consciousness gets diverted into partisan shouting matches. The system learned to sell us the rope as a limited edition designer accessory. And yet, in the cracks of this system, Marx's ghost keeps stirring. Unionization efforts at Starbucks and Amazon, tenant organizations fighting algorithmic rent hikes, the growing movement for a 4-day work week. These aren't full-blown revolutions, but they prove the underlying tensions he identified haven't disappeared. They've just put on new disguises. The old man's final surprise might be this: the most radical applications of his ideas are coming not from political revolutionaries, but from scientists and philosophers. Ecologists using his theories to model sustainable economies. Technologists exploring post-capitalist platforms based on cooperation rather than extraction. Feminist economists expanding his analysis to include unpaid care work. After centuries of being claimed and distorted by political movements, Marx's greatest legacy might be as a diagnostic tool for our present and a prompt for imagining futures beyond the limits of our current system. As we face down climate catastrophe, AI disruption, and spiraling inequality, Marx's fundamental question remains as urgent as ever. Who benefits from this system? And who pays the price? The answers keep changing. The question won't go away. And that, dear friend, is the story of Karl Marx, the brilliant, deeply human man who saw the gears of capitalism grinding workers to dust and spent his entire turbulent life trying to understand and ultimately stop them. Before you gently drift off to sleep, let's quickly retrace his extraordinary journey through the fog of history. We began in Trier, where a restless boy with a philosopher's mind grew up between Enlightenment ideals and Prussian oppression. That young Marx, brilliant, argumentative, and allergic to authority, would become the intellectual revolutionary who fled across Europe, from censored Cologne newspapers to Parisian cafes buzzing with radical dreams. Then came Engels, the capitalist son who funded the revolution, bringing first-hand accounts of factory horrors that would fuel Marx's greatest work. Together, they penned the Communist Manifesto in a blaze of furious inspiration. Its famous closing lines, "Workers of the world, unite," echoed far beyond their damp London exile. London. The British Museum became Marx's second home as he wrote Capital, that monstrous masterpiece, dissecting capitalism's hidden, systematic abyss. Picture him there, ink-stained, boil-ridden, and utterly consumed by the question, what if work didn't have to break people? The Paris Commune's bloody collapse broke his heart. The First International's infighting exhausted him. And through it all, personal tragedies piled up, dead children, a dying wife, and his own rapidly failing health. Yet even in his final years, Marx kept revising, rethinking, and raging against a system he saw as fundamentally and irredeemably unjust. After his death, history took his ideas and ran wild. Lenin wielded them in Russia. The Cold War twisted them into propaganda. Today, his ghost lingers in union battles, the climate crisis, and the quiet fury of gig workers staring at their Uber ratings at 2 a.m. So, why does Marx matter tonight? Because whether you're nodding off after a double shift, or just wondering why rent swallows your paycheck whole, his central, piercing question remains: who benefits from this system, and who pays the price? The answers are still unfolding for us all. Now, as the candle of history flickers low, let's leave Marx where we found him, In that quiet corner of the British Museum, scribbling furiously, chasing a fairer world one page at a time. The rest, dear listener, is up to us. If these journeys into history help you unwind, do us a kindness. Tap that like button, whisper, subscribe, and leave a comment below. What stays with you most about Marx's story, and who should we explore next? Now, close your eyes, let these ideas drift, and we'll meet again soon for another story. Sleep well.